Hello and welcome to the gallery. My name is Jon and today we will be painting a rhino. First off, I will have to apologize. I have a little bit of a sore throat and a little bit of a sickness in me. It's not the big one, but therefore my voice might be a little bit broken here and there during this video. But on to tonight's project. I have an old Chaos Rhino that I had extra bits for, and I wanted a 1000 Suns Rhino because I have a fair few 1000 Suns models. However, it's been on a shelf, staring me primed for 3-4 years maybe. Now I've gotten sick of looking at this thing unpainted, so we're gonna paint it. Let's start with painting the hull of it. Now let's start painting the rhino. What I like to do when I'm painting these bigger models or models in this size or with flat pieces or terrain pieces or something like that, I like to find a place on the model that nobody's gonna see or nobody's gonna notice or anything like that. And I like to put my first layer of paint down there just to see how it reacts with the primer, and also I can gauge how many layers I'm gonna need in the end. And in this case, I'm using 1000 Suns Blue for a 1000 Suns Rhino for my 1000 Suns Army. I could not have picked another color basically because I already have a fair few Rubric Marines and some Terminators, and they are painted with this color. Ergo, I'm using this color. For some few highlights here and there, I'm using Temple Guard Blue because that was the blue I used for the highlights of my Rubric Marines and everything like that. So that felt fitting here. I'm not doing any edge highlighting at this stage with the Temple Guard Blue. I'm more just hitting it from a 45-degree angle, some sort of zenithal type thing going. Not really though, because I'm just making variants in the blue. It'll go in waves across the model, and I'm hitting it from far away just to get some extra sheen here and there, just so it looks a little bit more interesting, a little bit more alive in big quotation marks. And after this is done, the airbrushing stage of this project is basically done. We just wanted the good color to come down to begin with. You could do this with a rattle can or a brush. I have an airbrush, therefore I used it. It was the perfect tool for the job. Now, I felt it was a little bit flat though afterwards, so I grabbed my Nuln Oil, I put it on my wet palette so it thins a little bit, and I started panel lining between all the bigger spokes like this and all the rivets and stuff like that, just to get some sort of variant and some sort of definition to these items. You can, of course, use a thinned out contrast paint if you're doing these big rhino things and big vehicles, but if you get a smooth undercoat, you might not want to mess that up, unless you're painting Nurgle. Then of course you can do whatever you want. Now I decided to paint some yellow, because the yellow stripes on the 1000 Suns helmet. In retrospect, I should have painted maybe the bit that I'm painting yellow in off-white, in a grey, something like that, because this yellow covers over blue. Well, not at all. This was layer after layer after layer, but in the end, after many layers, I think 7 or something like that, I finally got to a place where I could say, to hell with it, I don't care, this is yellow enough. I could still see a hint of bluish green underneath, but I was at that point just, no. I've done enough yellow for my lifetime now. Now for the yellow, I'm going to put a little bit of a recess shades with Yanden yellow, just to give it some sort of definition between the blue and the yellow. You could use a shade for this, you could use a contrast paint, you could use a different contrast paints, or you could actually mask everything off and airbrush the yellow in, which would have probably been also an easier task. But I used this contrast paint just to get some little bit of extra going. And for the block of yellow that is between there, I'm using a little bit of demonic yellow just to get some quick edge highlights on these on these corners and around these vents. just because it was a little bit flat, and the entire model looks like some sort of Swedish flag at the moment. So there are certain YouTubers, Squidmar, that might like that, but not me. I'm an Icelandic, not a Swede. Now for extra highlights on that, a little bit of palette witch flesh just to crisp it up a little bit more, and not the entire corner, just in the middle of it, to make it a little bit sharper looking. And that means the yellow is done after this, and I'm glad. Now, after I've done a little bit of edge highlights on the yellow, I felt, well, the blue might need some as well. So I grabbed a little bit of rust gray, and I used that as an edge highlight. Thinned it out quite a bit, so it's quite opaque, so it will feel a little bit bluer than when it goes down wet. And I'm just dragging the side of the brush by all the corners, mainly the corners facing up. I'm not too worried about the corners on the bottom of the tank, because we will do something else with that later on. But mainly on those most protruding corners, just dragging the side of the brush, getting a little bit of a highlight going, and especially on the sharper corners, like here on those vents of the things that's sticking out of the side of the thing. Just a little bit, dragging it across and getting some sharpness to it, and that goes a long way to sell the effect of size and sharpness and everything like that. Now that the hull is done, it's looking a little bit better, a little bit Swedish flaggy, but we'll let that slide for now. Let's work on some extra details with a little bit of the metallics. Now let's start working on the metallics, and there's quite a lot of gold that we'll be putting on this model. We're starting with quite a thick brush and retributor armor, and this might take a fair few coats. I think I did around 2 coats. In some places we were needing a third one. But it's the doors on the side, the stuff on the top, the stuff in the front, the other door, there's a little bit on the back, so that's a lot. That was quite a day. But in the end we finished and it looked fairly decent. Now we're gonna wash the entire gold bit with the Grime flesh. Now I put the contrast paint on the wet palette. It thins a little bit there, but that's perfectly fine, because we don't want it to be too saturated with the Grime flesh. We will lose a little bit of the shine when we're doing that. You could of course put a little bit of gloss medium into the Grime flesh, and then you get that shine back. Now once all the contrast paint has dried, I'm grabbing my Sigmarite dry paint, and I'm dry brushing that fairly roughly over all the gold bits, just to get some extra shine on them and make them look a little bit more sparkly here and there. This is a quick thing to do, because we don't have to be too neat or too worried. But after that is dried, I'm getting the Necron compounded dry paint, and I'm a little bit more focused when dry brushing this. I'm going from the top down, never up, rarely to the side unless I really have to, like down here. But mostly it's from the top down to catch the top edges, so it looks a little bit more shiny. Now, once all the gold's done, we still have a little bit of silver detail to do. I'm using the silver paint from Vallejo because I love it, as I've mentioned quite often already. And I'm brushing that over all the pieces that I want to have lights or windows, or, well, just metallic, like the tire tracks and the big spiky thing in front, the exhaust vents, the guns on the side. Everything that I want silver is getting this paint. And this paint is really nice when you start putting null oil on top of it, or any other shade or contrast, because it's so smooth. The paint will flow into the recesses and almost nothing will stay on the top. The main thing I like about that is you don't really have to highlight after you've done anything with a shade on top of it, because the highlights are still kind of there. Now for the front spiky bits, I used 2 coats of null oil, one thick one and one a little bit thinner one, just so I could get the shades where I wanted, because once you put the shade on, it'll matte it down a little bit, so the next layer will stick a little bit better. And for the tracks, I put 2-3 coats of null oil, and you still saw a lot of silver going through, but that's fine. You want it to look metallic, but not overly metallic, so a fair few coats of null oil, and you can really control how much shade you're getting if you put many coats and thin coats. Now the entire thing is looking a lot nicer, in my opinion at least. Before we continue, I would like to point out the Patreon thing I have going, as well as an Amazon affiliate store where you can purchase hobby supplies at no extra cost to you. I will get a small kickback. And also, like I said, the Patreon is the best way to support the channel if you feel like supporting it. Otherwise, just continue watching the videos and I will continue making them. Now let's go start working on some of the details for this thing. Now that the brunt of the work is done, let's focus on something different. So we're starting out with Blood Angels Red, and we're going over all the lenses. If we have turrets or anything like that, the lenses, they are getting this same color. And the windows here are getting this as well, just to have some sort of little bit of extra color going, because it's a lot of blue and yellowy gold colors going on. So something a little bit to break up the quite colorful monotony. And so the windows and the lenses are getting this red color. Actually, the lights, they are getting a Lamentus yellow. It's a glaze paint that I have a pot of and I really love. I don't know if they make them anymore, but you can of course use a yellow contrast paint, thin it out a little bit and use that instead, or a speed paint or anything like that. It just gives it this quick glow effect, and that's something I truly like. I like to have things quick and easy. Now, we have a little bit of stuff here that is, well, let's call it organic. So the horns on all these extra trim pieces, that shows that I have to neaten up the gold a little bit as well. I will do that later off camera. And this door thing, which we will have in a purple demon kind of looking thing, because why not? The pink horrors are part of this army, so let's give that door a pink horror feel later on. Now for the bone bits, I'm using Skeleton Horde, and what I like to do is drag it from the front and to the back, because where you lift your brush, that's where you will deposit most of the paint, so you get a darker tone in the back of the horn and a brighter tone in front. For the bigger horns that have these rings around them, I just do the bottom bit with the Skeleton Horde and do the dragging from the front to the back, just on the front bit, and that'll look pretty darn nice. It's a simple enough process, just have to go over all those horns. Probably you won't have this kind of model, but if you're doing horns, just go over all the bony bits and be careful where you're putting the paint and where you're dragging it. For the door, I'm using Volupus Pink. It's a nice color, and I thinned it out a little bit with contrast medium because it is a little bit on the pinky side, but I like to have it a little bit flowing better. I do extra layers maybe in the bottom recesses or something like that, just to get a little bit of more color going, but I liked how fleshy this looked when I did this. For the actual eyes, where I put the contrast paint, I just went back in with Wraithbone and filled that in so I could use a different paint for the actual irises and the eyes themselves. And that would be Iyanden yellow, so we get these orangey demonic eyes, and the yellow mixes well with the residue of pink we have in the corners of the eyes and gives it just a deeper shade, because that's what pink does underneath the yellow contrast paints, and that looks pretty darn nice in a simple enough way. For the actual eyes, the irises of the eyes, I put Thousand Suns Blue because it was the blue color I had close at hand, and I used 2 layers because otherwise it looks quite green over the orangey paint. So just 2 quick layers and these eyes were done, and most of the extra stuff at this point is done. The only thing left to do is focus a little bit on getting it looking a little bit more real, in my opinion. It's a little bit too shiny and happy, which is not chaosy at all. Everything of the Rhino is ready. It feels a little bit shiny. Let's make it a little less shiny, shall we? Now it's time to grime this baby up, and I'll be using this really disturbed brush that's almost ruined, and that's perfect for this kind of stuff. Rattling grime on the wet palette, and I'm starting with the tracks and all around the tracks up into the bluish stuff. And I'm not afraid to keep the palette a little bit too moist maybe, and the brush a little bit moist, so we get a thin, splotchy kind of look to this rattling grime, and it will give us a nice tone to start from, this old oil dirt thing that's starting to streak on it. After the first layer is dry of this, I go in a little bit and just a little bit here and there where I feel like it's missing something, adding a little bit of extra grime here and there. After that is drying, I'm going in with Carrick Stone, and this is with a heavy dilution of water and a very wet brush. Why Carrick Stone, I hear you ask in the corner of my mind. That's because the bases of my Thousand Suns are very sandstony, and therefore this was kind of fitting with that theme. And I'm stippling that on, and like I said, it's a very wet paint at this point, and therefore it will dry quite a lot lighter than it looks here. And just staple that on here and there just to give some extra feel. It's the next layer of dirt on top of the old brown layer of dirt that it already has. So we're getting some story behind it. Agrellan Badlands is the base paint that I use for my miniatures, for the Thousand Suns army, and therefore I'm stippling that on as well. I have the paint in this base here really diluted with water, and I'm stippling that on like I did with the Carrick Stone and the Rattling Grime. However, when I've done a little bit of a portion, I moisten my brush, I got most of the excess water, and I feather out with a stippling motion and a wet brush, just so the dirt feels a little bit more natural and seeps a little bit more. And then I continue on to the next part of the miniature, not letting anything dry really. Next is a little bit of Agric Earthshade, and I'm focusing it a little bit more. I'm not putting it everywhere, just a little bit here and there, a small dollop here and there, and then moistening the brush like I did with the Agrellan Earth, and stapling again a little bit just to feather it out and mix it a little bit more. And I feel like this gives the dirt a little bit more realness to it, and it looks a little bit more interesting. After this stage is done, I mean, the weathering of the bottom of this thing is quite good enough. It's a shiny thing, so they probably cleaned it at some point. I like the contrast that it's really shiny on top. There's not much battle damage because they like to care about things, I don't know. And then this dirty underneath because it's all obviously used. Now I'm using blood effects because it has spikes on the front, so I felt blood was necessary. However, when I'm putting blood effects down, I like to have some sort of story to it, not just willy-nilly here and there. So I felt like maybe it drove into something big and drove over it a little bit, so it hit it with the left corner. Maybe it's a maniacal driver. Who knows? And so we get this blood effect going on the left corner a little bit, and since it hit there, it probably went into the tracks a little bit, so a little bit here on the corner as well, and into the tracks both on the side of the actual hull and into the tracks underneath, so maybe something got stuck and lodged there, just to give some sort of feel and story to the actual blood effect. That's quite important in my opinion. Now I'm quite happy to field this with my army. It's finally ready, it's looking okay enough, it's tabletop ready, and that's most of my army. I'm here for the speed painting of most things, so this is definitely a part of that. Let's jump into the reveal and see how we did. And here we have it. Like you see, I painted a rubric marine to put on top, and I also have a missile launcher pod thing. Everything is just fastened with magnets, so I can interchange it at will. I like how it turned out. It's not the smoothest thing I've seen. We've got these mold lines and glue gobulets and everything, but it's good enough to field on the table, and I have it done, and that's the main idea. Not to have this staring me in the face for another 3-4 years. Thank you very much for joining me here today. There are links in the description for all kinds of stuff, social media, the Amazon store, and various tidbits. You do with it what you will. Like, share, and subscribe, and let the colors flow. But until next time, farewell.